We all want good things for our lives, and we dream about having them. We yearn for them. We work for them. In our minds, those good things can feel so real that we could almost touch them. And yet so often it's hard to make those dreams a reality, especially some of the deeper dreams, such as becoming a more loving, compassionate person, or finding deep and lasting friendships, or a marriage that's a meeting of minds and souls as well as a body. In fact, sometimes we can feel trapped, captured, if you will, by behaviors and desires that ambush us and pull us to live the opposite of those dreams. And it can be crushing to see ourselves doing that. And that state is symbolized by the captivity of the Jews in Babylon. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah represent parts of us that are striving to live a good life, but in the context and in the face of a lot of self-serving desires and thoughts that appear to be in charge. But sometimes we experience those negative emotions as coming from around us, from the people in whose environment we're living. And at others, we realize that those negative thoughts and feelings are coming from inside. We're susceptible to the voices from hell that lure us and captivate us. And at the core of this selfish part is the ego, or the proprium, the part that's most open to the influence from hell. And this is represented in our series by the king of Babylon. For the first 4 chapters in the 6-week series, the king was Nebuchadnezzar. Last week's story, the king was Belshazzar, and in this week's it's Darius. And these changing kings appear to describe a slight improvement, a slightly greater receptivity in that part of us to the Lord's spiritual life. And we'll see some of the evidence for that. So as we read, Darius divided his empire into 120 satraps, or regions, and set satraps over them, and over those were 3 governors. And Daniel was one of them. He distinguished himself so well that Darius was thinking about making him ruler of the whole realm, not just a third of it. So we can see the ego part of us, our more natural self, is seeing the value of the good parts. Or to put it another way, this is describing the external part of us becoming more aware of and sensitive to the inner desires that the Lord is giving us. And his consideration of making Daniel the ruler of the realm is very similar to the story of Joseph being set over the whole land of Egypt. So the other satraps, as we read, didn't like that, and they tried to discredit Daniel. When they couldn't find a way to discredit him, they realized the only thing they could do is go after his religion. And so they got Darius to sign the foolish petition, no one can worship any other god or being for 30 days, or they'd be thrown into a lion's den. And there was that repeated ritual statement, and I even cut out a couple of, this is according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be changed, not even by the king. Now notice here, Darius didn't choose this. In the prior stories, the king had made the faulty decree. He was the source of it. In this instance, Darius went along with it. And this is insightful because our egos are susceptible to self-aggrandizing actions and desires. So even people who put a lot of work into serving the Lord and others can notice how the ego part of us wants praise and glory. So we're all susceptible to that, and when we're not paying attention, hellish voices can work their way into our minds and sabotage our good efforts, just as the satraps and the other governors tried to sabotage Darius' intentions. And in fact, they often attempt attack precisely when we have a good intention, just like Darius did here. We're about to make a spiritual step forward, and they're threatened. So we can take actually these attacks as a very positive sign. In a way that these hellish emotions can blindside or sabotage us is by coming in the background in ways that we don't necessarily pay attention to. Darius was theoretically the king with all power, and yet he let himself be manipulated. Similarly, emotions like shame or fear can lurk in the background, causing us to take protective steps that quietly influence our conscious thinking. So someone who is susceptible to shame might be trying to do the right thing in a relationship, perhaps owning up to his part in a quarrel. Then the hells might make him fear that if he were to do this, it was going to be a huge problem. It's going to have repercussions in the relationship that would be embarrassing and shameful to him. So he might fall back on that mighty pride and firmly stand by his own opinion, setting it up as a god to be worshipped, even though his better self really knows the truth. So there are a lot of emotions like that: fear, worry, jealousy, discontent, pride, that can sabotage our good intentions, often operating in the background and stimulating our ego to make foolish stands. So Daniel, knowing that the decree had been signed, went home, opened the window to Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day, as he always did. He didn't pray in secret, but with the windows open. And in keeping with the practice of that day, he would almost certainly have prayed aloud, so that the people outside could have heard him had they been listening to it. And if you've ever heard Jews praying, you know that it has a very ritual, sing-song quality that's very hard to miss. So you would absolutely know someone was praying if you heard that. So Daniel, whose name means God is my judge, quietly goes about letting the Lord be his judge. He lives as the Lord told him. He wasn't ostentatious about his prayers like the scribes and Pharisees, but neither did he hide it. The ritual quality of his prayer 3 times a day echoes the ritual quality of the Holy Supper that's going to be offered today. We're told in New Church teaching that the 3 times he prayed each day stands for trying to give ourselves completely to the Lord. And similarly, when we come forward for Holy Supper, we ask the Lord to fill our whole beings. We try to give ourselves to him completely and ask for his help. We ask for his love and wisdom in our souls, his truth and a desire to follow him in our conscious mind and hearts. And then at the same time, we take in bread and wine, filling our bodies at that lowest level. And by taking it in community, as we will, we acknowledge to the Lord and to others that we need that help, just as Daniel had his window open. The Lord offers the assurance that he will respond to prayer. You will call upon me and go and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. And it's the same with the Holy Supper. There's an irony in this story in that Daniel is a captive, and yet he is truly free, and Darius theoretically has complete freedom to do what he wants, and yet he allows himself to be trapped or captivated into a foolish proclamation. We read in New Church teaching, the Lord's presence brings freedom. One follows the other. The more the Lord is present, the more free a person becomes. On the other hand, the influx of hell by way of evil spirits brings with it a force and impulsion to dominate. Their whole intention is to subjugate a person to the point of making him nothing and themselves everything. And when they are everything, a person is one of them. It is scarcely one of them, but in their eyes is a veritable nobody. Consequently, when the Lord is freeing a person from their yoke and dominion, conflict arises. But once he's been set free, that is, been regenerated, he is led by the Lord through angels so gently that no yoke or dominion exists at all, for he is being led by what is joyful and pleasing. He is being loved, and he is being shown respect. This is what the Lord teaches in Matthew. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. So Daniel was constrained seemingly from praying to his God, and yet he acted from that inner freedom that cannot be taken away, praying because it was who he was. And Darius found himself trapped by having given in to those foolish voices, just as when we give in to our ego, we're trapped by the voices of hell. And because Darius was trapped, a conflict arises, which is meant by Daniel's being thrown into the lion's den. Now, before allowing this, we see Darius struggling, it seems like for hours, to avoid throwing him in. He didn't want Daniel to die, but he was trapped by his own actions. And probably many of us have found ourselves in similar situations in which we've made a choice, but we hadn't thought through or noticed the consequences. So perhaps we said something unkind without realizing how deeply it would hurt, or we've been unaware or thoughtless in our actions only to have the awareness of what we've actually done come crashing down around us. And like it or not, we can't undo our choices. And especially when patterns of living allow the hells into our lives, we have to go through the fire into the lion's den if we want to remove their influence. So while Darius fasted and didn't sleep and declared that Daniel's God would change him, Daniel spent the night in the lion's den. Now, in many ways, this trial was more a trial about Darius than about Daniel. Darius was seeing what his actions had brought him to. There was a threat of loss, an emptying out of his joy and delight, and that's symbolized by his fasting all night. So the Lord asks us why we worry about external things like food and clothing, and we might add with being thought great or important, like the ego tends to want. He says, seek first the kingdom of God and his justice, and all these things will be added to you. So Daniel did that. He trusted that if he followed the Lord, it would work. And it did. Darius, by contrast, learned to see that the external things that he had been wanting had no value if he lost Daniel. If we, as we come to Holy Supper, can hold that awareness, if I lose the Lord in me, all the other things that I have no value. That is what enables us to give ourselves completely to him and to receive his blessing. And then we come to realize that all things are added to us. Not that we get what our ego wanted. We may not get money or fame or people doing what we want. What we get instead is the awareness that we have in our external life all the things necessary to lead happy lives. So, as an example, think of someone walking outside on a beautiful fall day in a grumpy mood or full of worry. She wants people to behave as she wants, and if they do, she thinks, well, she can be happy. if she can go through the process of letting go of that emotion, she can wake up, as it were, and then notice this incredibly beautiful scenery around her. And maybe she sees that person who was not behaving as she wanted and notices instead the good qualities in that person that she loves instead of the ones that she found annoying. And so she would be filled by allowing the Lord to be present and giving herself to Him completely. And that's not to say that this struggle, this trial, is without pain. We read in the Psalms, "My soul is among lions. I lie among the sons of men who are set on fire, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword." In those trials, it does feel like there's little hope for us, just as being thrown into a den of lions for a night would be a pretty hopeless affair. In the very next psalm, though, we read a prayer. "Break the teeth of their mouth, O God. Break out the fangs of the young lions, O Jehovah." So yes, we are surrounded for a time. But we ask the Lord to keep us safe, and He does so for our spirits. To those who are in a life of love and charity, we read, what they are to ask is given them from the Lord. Therefore they ask nothing but what is good, and that is done for them. When Darius saw that Daniel had been rescued, he threw his accusers into the pit, which describes that when we come through a spiritual trial, the selfish motives that had been driving us lurking in the background are exposed, and they are destroyed, and completely destroyed. It said their bones were crushed before they even came to the floor of the den. So absolutely instantly there's no hope for that negative emotion now to drive us. We read in New Church teaching, our power is limited. And when temptation stretches us to the absolute limit of our power, we cannot stand up to anything further and start to slip. At that point, however, that is, when we are on the slope and start to slip, we are raised up by the Lord and thereby delivered from despair. More often than not, we're then brought into a bright state of hope and the comfort this brings, but also into a state of bliss. Amen. Please rise.